The mainstream scientific community continues to distribute literature that claims humans and chimpanzees share a genetic similarity that is between 96 and 99%. This data is used as evidence to confirm the notion that humans and chimps evolved from a common ape-like ancestor several million years ago. This video investigates the reliability of that statistic and explores the process from which it was derived. Discover exactly what kind of genetic similarity humans actually do share with chimps and how that data should be interpreted in light of the clear teaching of Scripture. For all believers attempting to critically think their way through this deceptive generation, this becomes a particularly important topic to understand. There are a great many publications distributing literature that claims humans and chimps share a genetic similarity that is between 96 and 99%. Exploring a few of these sources provides evidence of how this information is not only being presented as confirmed factual science, but it is also being used to promote and validate the evolutionary worldview. An article from sciencemag.org entitled "Bonobos Join Chimps as Closest Human Relatives" had this to say: "Chimpanzees now have to share the distinction of being our closest living relative in the animal kingdom. An international team of researchers has sequenced the genome of the bonobo for the first time, confirming that it shares the same percentage of its DNA with us as chimps do. The team also found some small but tantalizing differences in the genomes of the three species, differences that may explain how bonobos and chimpanzees don't look or act like us, even though we share about 99% of our DNA." The American Museum of Natural History website features information from their collection of permanent exhibits. Under the exhibit Understanding Our Past, they state, "Although the human family originated many millions of years ago, we know a great deal about our remarkable past. The rich human fossil record dates back more than 6 million years, and scientists are finding exciting new specimens all the time. The emerging field of genomics enables researchers to use the countless genetic clues in human DNA to understand more about our identity, both past and present. Fossil evidence and genomic information powerfully agree on many points and are helping scientists piece together the origin and evolution of the entire hominid family, including our species, Homo sapiens." The museum then includes a page entitled "DNA, Comparing Humans and Chimps." The exhibit information claims humans and chimps share a surprising 98.8% of their DNA. Human and chimp DNA is so similar because the two species are so closely related. Humans, chimps, and bonobos descended from a single ancestor species that lived 6 or 7 million years ago. As humans and chimps gradually evolved from a common ancestor, their DNA, passed from generation to generation, changed too. In 2005, the National Institute of Health News reported the first comprehensive comparison of genetic blueprints of humans and chimpanzees shows our closest living relatives share perfect identity with 96% of our DNA sequence. The article goes on to say the consortium found that the chimp and human genomes are very similar and encode very similar proteins. The DNA sequence that can be directly compared between the two genomes is almost 99% identical. When DNA insertions and deletions are taken into account, humans and chimps still share about 96% of their genome sequence. At the protein level, 29% of genes code for the same amino sequences in chimps and humans. In fact, the typical human protein has accumulated just one unique chain since chimps and humans diverged from a common ancestor about 6 million years ago. Reporting on the same genomic research, Stefan Lovgren of the National Geographic News had this to say: "Scientists have sequenced the genome of the chimpanzee and found that humans are 96% similar to the great ape species. Darwin wasn't just provocative in saying that we descended from apes, he didn't go far enough," said Franz de Waal, a primate scientist at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. "We are apes in every way, from our long arms and tailless bodies to our habitats and temperament." This information can be extremely persuasive if not examined critically. Humans and chimps obviously have bodies that bear many striking similarities, and if we are nearly identical to them genetically, how is a Bible believer to respond? First and foremost, we must always remain steadfast and hold to the authority of the Scriptures. The Bible teaches clearly that all land-dwelling animals, as well as humans, were made on the sixth day, each being a distinct creation. However, only humans were made in the image of God. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth, each according to its kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, then everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Before investigating how scientists are actually determining the percentage of genetic similarity between humans and chimps, it is worth reviewing a few basics about the structure of the DNA molecule. Each rung of the DNA ladder is composed of a pair of 4 different nitrogenous bases. These include adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. These base pairs can only be configured in one of 4 possible combinations. An adenine molecule will only pair with a thymine molecule. Similarly, cytosine only pairs with guanine, and both of these pairings can combine in either order on a rung. Together, these 4 nucleotide bases have precise arrangements within the DNA molecule wherein their sequence codes for the information needed to create specific amino acids. For example, the cytosine, adenine, and guanine sequence codes for the amino acid glutamine. These codon triplets have 64 possible combinations that contain the information to assemble all of the 20 amino acids that are used to build all the various proteins needed to create all biological life. This means that the DNA molecule is a microscopic 4-character chemical coded language, a coded language that contains and expresses an astronomical amount of information. In fact, through careful study and experimentation, scientists have deciphered the entire code embedded in these codon triplets. The 64 possible permutations mean that some of the 20 amino acids have multiple configurations. Amazingly, this 4-character complex genetic code contains all the information needed to create all the bones, tissues, and organs for all of the 8.7 million species on Earth. So DNA clearly and obviously contains a coded language, and the most significant characteristic of a language is that it contains and expresses information. It is paramount to realize that information has never been observed to occur naturally, but instead information always originates from an intelligent source. Also worth noting, the entire sequence of these nitrogenous bases within a strand of DNA is referred to as a genome. There are 3 billion bases in a genome. This is equivalent to 3 gigs of data storage space. It has also been determined that if unwound, a single strand of DNA would stretch to nearly 6 feet long. And yet the molecule is so minuscule that it has been estimated that all the genetic information from every creature that ever lived could fit into a single spoon. With such an incredible amount of information embedded within each genome, it is important to first note, if our human DNA were actually 99% similar to that of chimps, it would still leave 15 million differences between the genomes of humans and chimpanzees. This is a staggering number of differences that cannot be ignored. However, when it comes to actually comparing human and chimp DNA to determine exactly how similar the genomes truly are, there are 3 deceptive practices scientists employ that intentionally inflate the percentage. It must be understood that what the mainstream media reports regarding the similarity of human and chimp DNA is not what it seems. Sequencing DNA is not a matter of simply lining up long strings with millions of bases to see what matches. In fact, there are 3 deceptive practices scientists use to arrive at such a high percentage of similarity. The first of which is that only sections that align naturally are compared. Dr. Jeffrey P. Tompkins explains, only carefully selected data were used to arrive at this greater than 98.5% conclusion. Evolutionists themselves have reported that only about 2/3 of chimpanzee DNA sequence can be unambiguously aligned, meaning precisely matched, to human DNA. This is because the algorithm used in the analysis stops matching the DNA sequence when the human and chimp segments become too dissimilar, which occurs after only a few hundred bases on average. This fact alone reveals the fraudulent nature of the percentage commonly reported by evolutionary proponents, because the two genomes are not being compared in their entirety. By comparing only the sections that align naturally, the deck is being intentionally stacked in their favor. What's worse, they are not disclosing this fact when they use these skewed percentages as conclusive evidence for human evolution. The second deceptive practice is that the only differences noted are single base pair substitutions. Dr. Elizabeth Melton explains, some sections of DNA strands being compared match like this, often because the same sorts of protein molecules are needed in living organisms. Because DNA consists of millions of bases, sequencing technology breaks it into short segments for comparison and then match up the pieces to be compared, effectively ignoring the segments that differ greatly. For example, when sequences being compared have only minor occasional variations, like in this illustration, these are referred to as substitutions. These are the only differences counted in determining similarities. However, when one section of the DNA being compared contains a sequence that is absent in the other genome, the difference is called an indel, meaning insertion-deletion. These types of differences are not generally included in the calculations of percent DNA similarity. Dr. David DeWitt provides some specific examples of these uncounted differences, including the fact that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, while chimpanzees have 24. Evolutionary scientists believe that one of the human chromosomes has been formed through the fusion of two small chromosomes in the chimp, instead of an intrinsic difference resulting from a separate creation. Amazingly, this entire extra chromosome and its 2.5 million base pairs are not factored into the percent of differences between humans and chimps. Dr. DeWitt also points out that while 18 pairs of chromosomes are virtually identical, chromosomes 4, 9, and 12 show evidence of being remodeled. In other words, the genes and markers on these chromosomes are not in the same order in the human and chimpanzee. Instead of being remodeled as the evolutionists suggest, these could logically also be intrinsic differences because of a separate creation. The great many differences from these three chromosomes include insertions and deletions, and large sequences that are inverted. As such, none of these variations are tabulated into the final percent of similarity between humans and chimps. The third deceptive practice employed in determining our genetic similarity to chimps is that repeated sequences are ignored. When scientists identify stretches of repeating code, these also are treated as insertion deletions and are not counted as differences. For example, at the end of each chromosome is a string of repeating DNA sequences called a telomere. Chimpanzees and other apes have about 23 kilobases of repeats. A kilobase is 1,000 base pairs of DNA. Humans are unique among primates with much shorter telomeres, only about 10 kilobases long. So here is another specific example in which clear differences, this time 33,000 of them, are not being counted and factored into the final percentage. Minute Earth is a popular YouTube channel with over 1.5 million subscribers that explores a variety of different science-related topics from an evolutionary perspective. Amazingly, they have produced a video that addresses all these deceptive practices and provides a much more honest assessment of the genetic similarity between humans and chimps.
It's often said that we humans share 50% of our DNA with bananas, 80% with dogs, and 99% with chimpanzees. Taken literally, those numbers make it sound like we could pluck one cell from a chimp and one from a human, pull out the tangled bundles of DNA known as chromosomes, unroll each one like a scroll, and read off two nearly identical strings of letters. But in reality, the human and chimp scrolls don't sync up so easily. In the 6 to 8 million years since we split from our last common ancestor, chance mutations and natural selection have changed each of our genomes in radical and unique ways. 2 human scrolls fused, leaving us with 23 pairs of chromosomes to chimps' 24. Other large mutations revised huge sections of text, duplicating a chunk of human DNA here, erasing a chunk of chimp DNA there, while throughout the scrolls, tiny mutations swapped one letter for another. When researchers sat down to compare the chimp and human genomes, those single-letter differences were easy to tally, but the big mismatch sections weren't. For example, if a genetic paragraph, thousands of letters long, appears twice in a human scroll, but only once in its chimp counterpart, should that second human copy count as thousands of changes, or just one? And what about identical paragraphs that appear in both genomes, but in different places, or in reverse order, or broken up into pieces? Rather than monkey around with these difficult questions, the researchers simply excluded all the large mismatch sections, a whopping 1.3 billion letters in all, and performed a letter-by-letter comparison on the remaining 2.4 billion, which turned out to be 98.77% identical. So, yes, we share 99% of our DNA with chimps if we ignore 18% of their genome and 25% of ours. And there's another problem. Just as a small tweak in a sentence can alter its meaning entirely, or not at all, a few mutations in DNA sometimes produce big changes in a creature's looks or behavior, whereas other times, lots of mutations make very little difference. So just counting up the number of genetic changes doesn't really tell us that much about how similar or different two creatures are. But that doesn't mean we can't learn anything by comparing their genomes. DNA contains a record of the evolutionary relationships between all organisms. It's a garbled record, but by reading closely, we've been able to glean enough information to refine the evolutionary trees we started drawing long before genome sequencing was around. We may not actually be 99% chimp, but we are 100% great ape, and at least a little bananas.
So if the genetic similarity between humans and chimps is not genuinely greater than 96%, why does this statistic continue to circulate around the internet and in textbooks? And if the genetic similarity is not authentic, how are we to interpret the images like this depicting quaint family scenes of species that appear to be evolutionary hybrids? After all, this painting, found on the Human Evolution Evidence page of the Smithsonian website, does seem to make the whole concept of humans evolving from an ape-like ancestor seem much more plausible and approachable. Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell astutely pinpoints the flawed logic behind this kind of faulty data. She writes, "The notion that genetic similarities prove shared evolutionary ancestry is a consequence of naturalistic Darwinian assumptions superimposed on the data. Evolutionists assume chimps and humans share an evolutionary ancestry and interpret all data according to that assumption. As Bible believers, we should recognize images like this for what they truly are: propaganda. These kinds of graphics are almost always displayed in conjunction with supposedly scientific data that are together designed to convince the general public that the godless notion of evolution over millions of years is confirmed fact. Propaganda is defined as information, ideas, or rumors deliberately spread widely to help or harm a person, group, movement, institution, nation, etc., or the deliberate spreading of such information, rumors, etc. Also, the particular doctrines or principles propagated by an organization or movement. The methodology behind how evolutionary concepts are perpetuated perfectly fits these definitions. There has been a great deal of inaccurate, unsubstantiated, and even fraudulent information widely circulated with the sole intent of persuading people to believe that evolution is authentic science. Perhaps one of the most well-known pieces of evolutionary propaganda is the Tree of Life. Inspired by a sketch by Charles Darwin himself, the concept is a beautifully simple and elegant representation of the evolutionary worldview. This is precisely why it is such a powerful tool. It is an easy-to-understand visual aid that we are led to believe is based on concrete scientific data. This, however, is simply not the case. Stephen Jay Gould, who died in 2001, was an American paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and historian of science. He was also one of the most influential and widely read writers of popular science of his generation. Gould spent most of his career teaching at Harvard University and working at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. In an article for Natural History magazine, Gould revealed this critically important fact regarding these propaganda graphics. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of the branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Another famous example of evolutionary propaganda is one that was publicly proven to be intentionally inaccurate. Ernst Haeckel was a professor of zoology in Germany from 1865 until 1909. In 1868, he fabricated the embryologic evidence for evolution by fraudulently producing these diagrams to prove the theory by demonstrating that humans closely resembled various animals early on in embryonic development. These diagrams have been taught in biology textbooks at the high school and university levels as recently as the 1990s, and the idea they purport to prove is still presented in textbooks today. The issue, however, is that reputable German scientists immediately began refuting his evidence by demonstrating that Haeckel had falsified his pictures. And now, with the advent of advanced modern photography, we can clearly see that this idea of embryonic similarity is categorically untrue. In 1912, the amateur archaeologist Charles Dawson claimed that he had discovered the missing link between ape and man after finding a section of a human-like skull in the Pleistocene gravel bed near Piltdown, East Sussex. The discovery was announced at a Geological Society meeting and was given the Latin name Eanthropus dawsoni. Almost 40 years later, in 1953, Piltdown Man, as it came to be known, was exposed as a forgery. The Piltdown Man fraud could be considered the greatest example of evolutionary gullibility of the 20th century. The man-made fossil included the skull from a modern human and the jawbone and teeth from an orangutan. The teeth had been filed down to make them look human. The bones and teeth had been chemically treated and sometimes even painted to give them the appearance of being ancient. This fraudulent artifact was touted as a missing link and proof of human evolution for over 4 decades. In 1921, fossilized skeletal remains were discovered in Snake Creek Quarry in western Nebraska and reassembled into a hybrid species that was labeled Hesperopithecus. This Nebraska man, as it came to be commonly known, was introduced to the world with an article in the Illustrated London News and included speculation about this species' habits and migration, as well as this elaborate illustration, all which was inspired by the fossil evidence. Nebraska Man was widely publicized and immediately accepted by the public as a documented and confirmed example of an evolutionary missing link. It even played an influential role in the public opinion leading up to the famous Scopes monkey trial. It is relevant to note that the fossilized remains from which all of this compelling evidence was inferred included only one single tooth. This single molar was later proven to have come from a Chacoan peccary, a species once thought to be extinct that is now living only in Paraguay and Argentina. Lucy, consisting of skeleton 40% complete, was discovered in Ethiopia by Donald Johanson in 1974 and was dated at 3.2 million years of age. He calculated her to have stood about 3 foot 6 inches tall and to have weighed about 50 pounds. Certain features suggested to Johansen that it may have walked erect and was therefore evolving into human. Several investigators, including secular paleoanthropologist Richard Leakey, have now concluded that 2 or perhaps 3 species have been wrongly combined in Lucy. She was not a human ancestor. At best, she was a form of extinct ape. At worst, she was a mosaic, yet she is still touted as the best evidence for human evolution. Since 1974, however, more bones have been recovered from other members of Lucy's species. Her toes have been shown to curve like tree-dwelling apes, her shoulders have been found to be nearly identical to living great apes, her wrists resemble those of other knuckle-walking ape species, and her hands, far from being like human hands, are similar to those of chimpanzees. In other words, Australopithecus was an ape, a tree-climbing, knuckle-walking, amazingly designed ape. The history of the evolutionary hypothesis has been plagued with supposed evidence that fails to stand up to serious scientific scrutiny. This is perhaps why the notion that humans and chimps possess nearly identical DNA has continued as one of the more prominent pieces of educational propaganda. Genetics is not an area of science with which the average individual is likely familiar. As such, they must trust that the mainstream scientific community is reporting accurate data. And as noted earlier, whenever there is a discussion of genetic similarity between humans and chimps, it is always in conjunction with and in the context of proving that humans evolved from an ape-like ancestor. Ultimately, biblical creationists and evolutionists are studying and analyzing the same evidence. It is our worldview, however, that shapes how we interpret and understand the data and give context to what has been found. There is an evolutionary analogy on the internet that clearly demonstrates how this bias works. It goes as follows. Imagine you were a teacher grading students' essays and saw two essays that you suspected might have been copied from another student due to some striking similarities. You read both essays and see that some sentences have been moved around, some wording has been changed, but then you notice that a particular word was misspelled. You look at the other students' essays and notice that those also have the exact same word misspelled in the exact same way. You keep sifting through and you find a few more words with the same characteristics, misspelled in a unique way, and these same misspellings are found in the same way throughout all three essays. What do you conclude? That each student just happened to independently misspell these specific words in highly specific ways? Or that two of the students copied portions of their essay from an original essay in which a student made that mistake? The same principle applies in comparative genomics, only with even more precision. When analyzing this evolutionary analogy, it seems completely appropriate to make a comparison between genetic sequencing and written language. DNA, after all, has all the hallmarks of written language. It has 4 characters, and the specific arrangement of these characters generates information. This information, however, is only accessible if the language in which it is written is known and understood. It must also be conceded that we have never observed information or language arise from anything other than an intelligent source. The problem with this analogy is the source of the original information and the unique misspellings contained within it. The analogy employs 2 students who are intelligent agents, copying from the written language generated by another student, also an intelligent agent. To truly align this analogy with evolutionary teaching, we would need to instead assume that the very molecules of ink managed to somehow arrange themselves into a coherent configuration of marks that could be understood as language. But understood by what? Or who? And where did the ink come from in the first place? And what about the paper and pen? When and how were these formed? An extremely important point must not be overlooked. The information in DNA is not contained within its chemical components, but in the arrangement of those chemical base pairs, in much the same way that the information contained in written words is not contained within the molecules of ink, but in the arrangement of those molecules. Instead of 2 students copying from one another, could it not be one original author writing 3 separate papers that have some aspects in common? One original source author with his own unique literary style and idiosyncratic spelling technique. The analogy also implies that some of the information in DNA is useless or in error. Perhaps we simply do not fully understand the complexity of the genetic dialect. It wasn't too long ago scientists believed that much of the genome was useless junk DNA. It is now understood, however, thanks to the ENCODE project, or the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, that more than 80% of DNA that isn't involved with protein coding does have at least one biochemical function, which means it is extremely unlikely that there is any span of the DNA molecule that does not contain some variety of complex information. The fact is, it makes perfect sense that humans and chimps would actually need to share a certain amount of genetic information. Vern Poitras explains, the most striking genetic similarities between humans and chimps lie in many of the protein coding regions within the DNA. That is understandable from the standpoint of design, because proteins are the backbone of chemical machinery inside a cell. Cells have to have machinery for metabolism, for cell division, for translating DNA into proteins, for dealing with toxins, and for responding to the environment. The machinery has to accomplish many of the same things in cells of many kinds, so it should not be surprising that there are similarities among proteins not only between man and chimpanzee, but throughout the world of living things. This is not unlike the tendency of human designers to frequently incorporate wheels into a variety of products, or regularly utilize similar materials like metal, plastic, rubber, and wood for specific purposes within these designs. These objects clearly reveal that they had a designer, and obviously do not lead to the assumption that they arose naturalistically from a common ancestor. Should not the infinitely more complex properties of all biological life lead to the same conclusions? The following video by the Institute for Creation Research further explores this fact that all life on Earth would actually need to share a significant amount of genetic similarity for many common functions.
We've all heard the theory that chimps are close human relatives, but is there any truth to that? Secular scientists claimed in the 1970s that chimp genomes are 98% similar to humans, and it was apparently verified by more modern techniques. But that estimate actually used isolated segments of DNA that we already share with chimps, not the whole genomes. The latest comparison to include all of the DNA between the two species revealed only a 70% identity, a huge difference from what scientists have been claiming for years. And a 70% similarity really isn't surprising. Chimps and humans, and even dogs, cats, horses, and more, share some basic similarities: metabolizing foods, growing hair, breathing air, and drinking water. So of course, much of the genetic material would have to be the same. But chimps don't have the intellectual abilities of humans to create or communicate, or the creative abilities in their hands. For example, they cannot build hospitals, operate on one another, play baseball, or write poetry. So it makes sense that when new research compared each chimp chromosome piece by piece to the corresponding human chromosome pieces, they were 30% different. In fact, 900 million DNA letter differences separate the two species. Far too many precise and vital bits of information for any source other than genius intelligence to generate. Chimps and humans are very different, not only in their anatomy and behavioral traits, but also in their genomes. When the entire genomes of humans and chimps are compared, it becomes clear that they were each engineered uniquely and separately by an omnipotent genius creator.
Not surprisingly, the mainstream media is not reporting this important new data that human DNA is only 70% similar to chimps. As the video mentioned, that means there are actually 900 million differences between the genomes of humans and chimpanzees. To put this number into perspective, a typical page of text might have 4,000 letters and spaces. It would take 225,000 full pages of text to equal 900 million letters. This would produce a book 37.5 feet tall. That would be a book taller than a 3-story building. That is truly an astronomical amount of information. So in conclusion, it has been clearly shown that humans and chimps are not 99% genetically similar. In fact, this commonly cited statistic is based on deceptive practices and is clearly used as evolutionary propaganda. In addition, recent scientific studies have revealed that humans and chimps only share 70% genetic similarity. This should be expected since all life on Earth shares common biological functions. It is also worth stressing again that DNA is a nanoscopic-sized coded language, and the fundamental purpose of any language is that it expresses information. And as all observable, testable, and repeatable evidence confirms, information only ever derives from intelligence. The Bible is the only accurate and indisputable source of truth, whether one believes it or not. And once again, a genuine exploration of the real scientific data confirms the clear teaching of Scripture. As believers, we can remain confident and allow our faith to be strengthened by this fact. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse.